I'm going to introduce another great guy from the past, her doctor, Professor Karl Popper, and he was a professor of logic and scientific method and quite famous in philosophy circles. You don't need to read out that, but essentially he had a principle, and it's hugely important in engineering world and everywhere. And it is that there's an asymmetry in evidence. If you have 10 pieces of evidence supporting a hypothesis, you really want to find one piece that conflicts and says the hypothesis is wrong. Because one negative piece of evidence for a hypothesis will overturn many, many positive pieces. Anyone can get affirmatory data, but it's conflicting data that stands alone. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies here around that principle. Here we have a study with middle-aged men and coronary vascular disease events. And we see some old friends, the HDL and the ApoB, which is the LDL particle count that Dave Feldman's going to talk about later. And these are risk markers, established ones. So in this study, you see that the people who had high HDL and low ApoB particle count, right? That's good. Yeah, it's good. You can see the rate of heart disease events was really low. They were the best guys. If people had low HDL or they had high ApoB, then they had much higher rates, 4 times, and that makes sense. If they had low HDL and high ApoB together, synergistically, they had an over 8x risk of a cardiovascular event. So this is all well and good, and most people might be a little familiar with this. But then, Karl Popper came to me in a dream, and he whispered in my ear as I slumbered, a bit like the Scrooge thing. And he said, Ivor, look to the Catavans, right, for a black swan. I said, okay, Karl, I'm on it. So next morning I got up and I looked up Catavan studies. Now, Catavans have so low heart disease that they are actually researched and studied by teams around the world for the past decades. Their heart disease is so low. So we know they're incredibly low in heart disease. And they'd be down there somewhere at the best of the best. Okay. But what about their markers? Well, actually, they have very low HDL, the lowest here, and they have very high ApoB. On average, they're above 1. That's interesting, isn't it? And that means that they should have the highest rate of heart disease. And in fact, their heart disease rate is out of whack with what their markers say by an order of magnitude, by 10 times. And this is really important. It's Popper's negative evidence. So we look at what else they have going on that might explain this. Well, they have very low insulin levels, incredibly low, and they don't rise over their lifetime in their environment. Very low blood glucose, no diabetic physiology versus the majority of us in the Western world. Great omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in their diet, and they have no hypertension, and their blood pressure does not rise with age, unless they come over to the West, of course. And a lot more important factors. Now, when all these important factors are resolved and working, it would appear that these markers are only markers. And we can get an insight that they may be markers of dysfunction, but if you don't have the dysfunction, the markers fail because they're not as directly independently causal as the other things we talked about a few minutes ago, or the right-hand side of the page there. So this is an important lesson. You've got to be really careful with markers and focus on the ones that are independently causal and powerful, a la Pareto. You could say that these guys were sent from outer space, these Catavans, or they're genetic mutants. They're not. Many, many papers looking at indigenous peoples. When they leave their indigenous homeland, diet and lifestyle and environment, and they come to the West, they get as bad as us or worse even. And when they go back, there are papers showing that they recover their health. So that doesn't get this black swan off the hook.